All right. So one might think that there are other ways, not just through the market, but through other cultural forces that classes are created. They might have an intersectional analysis of class in terms of gender, in terms of race, and what have you. Probably race being the biggest one. They'll point out that in America, poverty is largely a feminized phenomenon. It's largely a racialized phenomenon. Historically disenfranchised racial groups tend to be poorer. The poorest people tend to be women with children, single women with children. I'm sorry. And they might think maybe what's going on a bit here is there's an ideology that's maybe the state helps use, but is largely independent of the apparatus of the state that stops these people from accumulating wealth. So discrimination against these groups and what have you. And so to think that it's largely just the state that creates these classes is to miss, this large cultural, social explanation. So what's the left libertarian response to that, or how do they incorporate that insight?
I mean, there's division among left libertarians on this issue.
What's your take, I guess?
Because I'll just say I know some left libertarians who remind me a bit of vulgar Marxists in the sense of saying, really, it's just the state. Sort of the left libertarian analog of vulgar Marxists. It's just the state. It's just the. And I don't think that's the case. I definitely think that culture and ideology and so forth matter. And also, of course, I don't think that the state is the only form of violence. Particularly if we're talking about gender politics. A lot of the violence that male violence against women is not made by the state. It's sort of freelance violence that helps to maintain power and balance between men and women. And I don't discount that. But I think that having the market incentives as opposed to government incentives is very effective in combating it, even if it's not all you need. And here's a distinction I'd want to make. So a lot of libertarians are going to say, when they talk about discrimination, a lot of them are going to say, look, discrimination is costly because if you're if you're not hiring the best people or having the best customers, then it hurts you economically, and so the market incentives will just.
This is like Gary Becker and Milton Friedman's mistake.
And I think that's overstated. I think that because there are, I think there is a way that market helps to solve that problem, but not quite the way people think, because a lot of people, if they're prejudiced and their peer group is also prejudiced, they may not want to go against their peer group. Suppose that you're living in you're a white guy living in a racist white community, and you want to pay your black employees more, or you want to accept black customers to get more money, but then that you're going to be shunned by your white peer group. You might not do it. I think that the attraction, the way that the economic thing works, is not so much, and often the way that economics breaks up cartels in general, because this is a kind of a racial cartel, is not so much that it leads members of the cartel to cheat on each other, because often they have non-monetary reasons to hang together, but then it brings in outsiders who aren't part of that culture. So here's a story about my grandmother. So my grandmother lived in, she wasn't from Florida. She was from Chicago. She moved to Florida in the 1940s, maybe, at Daytona Beach, and she paid her black servants way more than her white neighbors did. Not because she wasn't racist. She was racist as hell. But her flavor of racism was different from the local flavor. And she didn't do it just to get the best employees, although, in fact, that was the result and caused all the neighbors to complain. She did it just because she thought it was unclassy to pay people below a certain level. It was below her dignity to pay people that little. It's some image of I don't know what. So anyway, so her motives were not ideal, but at any rate, as a matter of fact, she did get economic benefits from from getting the best of the local black employees, because she wasn't part of this local group. She wasn't planning to live forever in Florida. She didn't identify with this peer group. She didn't give a crap what they thought about anything. And so as I said, she wasn't motivated primarily by the economic incentives. That was probably part of it. And so I think in general, economic incentives break up cartels more successfully by luring competitors in from the outside than necessarily from breaking up the cartel from within. So I think those things can be effective, but also I think we shouldn't think of the market as just a matter of sitting back and letting the price system take care of things. I mean, I think the price system is amazing. It can, in fact, take care of lots and lots of things. But also, I think we think of the markets as sort of the totality of free exchanges. Not all free exchanges are just matters of, I want to maximize my monetary profit or something like that. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a vital role for, deliberate social action to try and change the culture. And, I think, I think that, even if people weren't like that, I think if everyone were just sort of robotic profit maximizers, I think that, the market would solve these things pretty well. But as long as you've got, a lot of people who are being driven by bad non-monetary incentives, it's really crucial to have people driven by good non-monetary incentives to combat it. And so I think that, that's one of the reasons I think that, libertarians shouldn't focus just on getting rid of state intervention, even though I think state intervention is a huge part of the story, but that they should also be focused on getting involved in these kinds of solidarity movements, of precisely the sorts of things that intersectional feminists and race theorists and so forth are interested in. So, so I think that although we're a lot more optimistic than a lot of sort of more traditional leftists are about the power of markets and so forth, nevertheless, I think that these other movements are absolutely crucial too, and we should be supporting them.
Right, that's very good. I guess that's enough on the distinguishing features of libertarian class theory. Maybe we can go into the normative motivations for that project. Maybe we can go into what we care about with egalitarianism. I think you have a paper called Egalitarianism, the Unknown Ideal. I realized I just accidentally gave the title of Liz Anderson's paper, which is a slightly different account of yours. But what sort of egalitarianism do you buy into? What do you think the point of distributive justice is? And why, there's this classic, libertarian view that distributive justice is, to paraphrase Hayek, a mirage of some sorts. That we shouldn't care about it because free exchange can create unequal wealth distributions, even if the free exchange is completely valid. Yeah. Like Nozick made that argument with his Will Chamberlain example. So why should we care about?
Yeah, and I should say that my views have evolved somewhat since I wrote that article.
Oh, they have. Okay.
I'm not sure I disagree with anything I said in that article, but probably sort of the range of kinds of equality I'm interested in is probably greater than that now. So what I said back in that article was that the libertarian conception of freedom is itself a form of egalitarianism.
Right.
The idea was equality of authority, an idea that goes back to Locke. When Locke and Jefferson say that we're all created equal, what they mean is what the kind of equality they have in mind is equality of authority. No one has the right to tell anyone else what to do.
And that's something that most liberal theories share in general.
In principle, but they end up supporting an organization that, so one criticism of the state is an organization that is unequal. Mm-hmm. There's this massive, so people think of the state's job is to ensure equality among the governed, but the question is, what about equality between the governed and the governors? That there's this inequality in power, and you can say, well, if it's a democratic state, then somehow it's really all just us, or we control it, or we rotate into and out of it, and so forth. But in practice, you end up getting some people with political office, or people with private political influence, or people with badges and guns and truncheons, end up being in a position to impose stuff on us that we can't impose, that we don't have a comparable right to impose back on them. So there's a sense in which just the basic libertarian conception of freedom is itself a form of egalitarianism. But that's not. But
yeah.
I wouldn't limit my egalitarianism to that. So I think that's a very important form of egalitarianism. It would be worthwhile having that, even if we didn't get the kind of wealth equality that I would expect. But I see, the wealth equality that I expect. I also think it's valuable in its own right. People often say, a lot of right libertarians say, well, look, it's not the degree of equality of wealth that matters. All that matters is sort of
how it was attained.
Yeah. Well, also they'll say what matters is as long as it's going up, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And I think they're half right in the sense that my ideal my ideal to getting rid of wealth inequality would not be if I could do it by sort of reducing everyone to the to equal level of poverty or something like that. But of course that's not what So take something like Rawls's principle,
right,
which is that you have that deviations from equality are fine so long as the worst off people are better off than they would be under equality. So that's not the kind of egalitarianism that wants us all to be sort of reduced to that would get rid of equality by reducing us all to some sort of Harrison Bergeron equality. Now I don't so I think that there is a genuine a lot of libertarians say that they don't see any value
in anything like that distributive justice.
Yes.
Conception.
And I see some value to it. I certainly don't think it's the whole story of justice. I don't think that it trumps the kinds of property rights considerations that someone like Nozick has. But I think that there is suppose we all became fantastically much more wealthy than we are, but it was still massively unequal. I think there'd be a problem. I mean, I'd take it, but there'd be a problem because how we relate to each other in society, what kinds of opportunities we have to interact, and the possibility of sort of being left out of things.
The relational egalitarianism of Liz Anderson is what you have in mind.
Maybe something like that. Yeah. And of course, to a lot of right libertarians, it's just going to sound like envy. But it's not envy in the sense of, I resent you from having more and I want to take it away from you. It's like, I want to be sort of a full participant in this society. Now, how does the value of that kind of concern relate to the value of something like, Nozickian rights? Well, this is where my Aristotelianism comes in. Okay. So, the Aristotelian view, at least as I interpret the idea of the unity of virtue,
right,
is that so the traditional way of putting the idea of unity of virtue is that you can't have one virtue completely without having them all. The strong version of it is that there's all the virtues, just different names for one virtue. That's like Socrates' view. That's not Aristotle's view. Aristotle's view is different virtues.
To be courageous, you will also
to be fully courageous.
To be fully, or I guess a better example is given is to be fully benevolent in certain situations. You're going to have to do the courageous thing, so you have to be courageous.
Yeah. So the idea is that if you're, so the idea is he doesn't rule out the possibility that you could be like 70% benevolent or only 40% courageous or something like that. I think that he would allow that, but you couldn't be 100% benevolent without being 100% courageous, because there are going to be cases where doing the benevolent thing requires facing some kind of danger or whatever. But for me, the most important point about the unity of virtue is not just that you can't have one without having them all, but that you can't settle what it means. You can't settle what courage requires of you without figuring out what benevolence requires of you, and vice versa. So that the contents of the virtues are interdefined. Each one has some sort of provisional content to begin with. But as you work out the details, there's a kind of mutual adjustment to come up with their content. So I think that there are, so there are some virtues that are, sort of very much social consequence oriented, like benevolence, and there's some that are much more sort of deontic and rights oriented, like justice. But if those two are standing in relation to a sort of reciprocal determination, that means that in filling on in one, you also have to fill in the other, so that you may have to adjust the content of justice to fit consequentialist concerns, but also you may have to adjust the concept of what counts as a good result by concerns of justice.
Okay, so that's a really fascinating... I hadn't heard you make that argument for it. And that's a really fascinating use of the unity of virtue, which is a doctrine that I'm generally skeptical of, because I'm not much of an Aristotelian myself. But one objection that comes to mind to that is that, well, it doesn't look like we need to fully conceptually spell out what a just distributive society is. I guess the way you cashed out was in terms of benevolent. What a benevolently distributive society would be, although in the literature it's usually talked about in terms of justice, but since we're in virtue theory now, we should keep those two distinct, I guess.
Well, except I'm saying that benevolence feeds into determining the content of justice. So.
All right, that's the claim.
Yeah.
And it looks to me like if what we mean by justice here is like non-aggression libertarian stuff, that, you know, what justice demands of you is that you don't initiate force or fraud, blah, 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 in illegitimate ways, it doesn't look like you need to make much reference to distributive justice to know what that is. And a Rawlsian would push back to say, well, I don't really need to refer to a theory of property rights to know what a just society looks like distributively. So it looks like, why would we think that there's this important sort of conceptual link to them in this unity of virtue way?
Well, there are, you know, so there are different ways of specifying the general libertarian principles. You've got very general libertarian principles about rights and so forth. There are different ways of specifying the details. And likewise, you can have, you know, general concerns about distributive justice and different ways of specifying the details. And the idea is that, you know, each one has some content of its own. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't start off as a blank slate. Because if they all start off as blank slates, then trying to mutually adjust blank slates wouldn't get you anywhere. But the idea is that it's reasonable to take these distributive concerns into account when choosing among different ways of instantiating the basic libertarian principles, and vice versa.
So give me some examples.
So, all right. So here's, you know, so this isn't really sort of a matter of social policy. It's more a social matter of sort of individual action. But, you know, questions like, you know, is it all right to steal bread when you're starving or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's one right libertarian view would say no, it's your duty to starve. There was, back in the 90s, the Liberty magazine had this poll where they asked people if you are falling out of a building and you are to grab onto someone else's balcony to prevent yourself from falling to your death,
mm-hmm.
and they say, get off my balcony, are you obligated to let go and fall to your death? And there was a significant percentage that said yes. And in fact, that example ended up getting incorporated into one of L. Neil Smith's science fiction
mm-hmm.
libertarian novels, where he seemed to endorse that position. And so the question is, well, you know, that's one interpretation of the libertarian principle, but you could also have the interpretation that in a situation like that, what you owe them is maybe something like reparation afterward, but not actually, you know, so maybe, you know, or if you know, breaking into someone's cabin to avoid freezing to death or something, you know, should we say that you're just required to die, or can we say that in emergency situations it's all right to make use of their property, but then you should do your best if possible to make restitution to them later, and say, well, in choosing among those different interpretations, it makes sense to take into account, you know, considerations of benevolence and welfare and so forth, and as you choose the, you know, the less creepy answers to those questions. That would be an example. And likewise, in terms of, let's say, there are different ways of interpreting land rights. So, what exactly?
Occupancy and use versus homesteading, or what?
Yeah, and also things like, you know, even in cases where you don't actually get full property title to something, what do you have to do in order to get an easement? So there are some libertarians who will say, well, look, if someone buys up all the land around your house, well, you should have contractually acquired an easement before that. If you didn't, well, you're just out of luck. You can just come in and out by helicopter. Versus the view that, no, by buying up all the land around your house, not letting you out, they're imprisoning you, and so they're violating your liberty. So those are two different ways of interpreting libertarian principle. Well, it's legitimate to bring in social welfare considerations, to choose, which of those, to choose between them. And it would say, well, in light of those, it'll be more reasonable to take the one that they have to give you an easement. And likewise, I'm talking about things like Native American land rights, where some people say, well, look, in the cases of the nomadic tribes, who maybe they weren't altering their landscape enough to get full ownership, so could you just grab all that stuff that they hunted over, or were they entitled to an easement at least over the areas that they hunted, even if they didn't have full property rights? And you could say, well, in terms of, if you take benevolence seriously, it's going to be in favor of giving them an easement as opposed to what actually happened. Though, of course, what actually happened was, even Indian tribes that had farms and settled land and stuff that would clearly have been private property by standard Lockean views. The government took that too, so it wasn't as though the government was just sort of misapplying libertarian principles. But some libertarians have argued, well, at least for the nomadic tribes didn't have any property rights, so you could just take whatever. And I think that's going to be a less plausible interpretation once you bring in benevolence to choose among these different interpretations of libertarian principle.
Right. That's really interesting. Another thing that came to mind is it's pretty uncontroversial among mainstream political philosophers, as I take it, to adjust one's view of distributive justice in light of other justice considerations. Like the famous objection to egalitarianism is it would require continual interventions into your life in problematic ways that violate liberal justice to correct for bad luck. Like maybe we need to control how people parent their kids or what have you. All right, I think that's really interesting. The other thought that I have when you apply the doctrine of virtue to try to link these a thick conception of distributive justice with a thinner libertarian view is one might think that virtue theory is something that should only apply to individuals. When we talk about the virtue of courage, benevolence, blah blah blah, that's something that works with individuals. It doesn't really apply to whole societies, to whole polities. And it would be some sort of fallacy to start applying virtues to society. So why should we be using a doctrine like unity of the virtue to try to link features that we want societies to have when they're not really virtues proper? Well,
all these decisions are made by individuals. Mm-hmm. So anyone who's implementing, anyone who's acting, and doing a role in being part of a legal system or something, whether they're a judge or a legal theorist or some kind of law enforcement person or rights protector, whatever they are, all the people who are the agents of the legal system, be it a state or some kind of something more anarchic, they're individuals, and the individual conduct is governed by the virtues. And everything the state does ultimately, or whatever any legal system, state or anarchic does, is happens in virtue of individuals making decisions, and they're always going to be governed by these virtue considerations. So, you don't get off the hook for following the virtues just because you're acting as an agent of a legal system. So, now of course, the traditional virtue theorists, they thought of the purpose of the state as to promote virtue, and so they were very paternalistic and intrusive. Not all of them as paternalistic and intrusive as Plato's Republic.
This is like Aristotle's Politics.
Yeah, so Aristotle's Politics, it looks very libertarian compared to Plato's Republic, but it looks a lot like Plato's Republic compared to libertarianism. But I think that what they failed to think about was they were thinking about virtue as something to promote, but they were forgetting about the ways in which virtue should constrain the behavior of the people running the system. And so, suppose that I think that there's this value of respect that you owe to all other people. It's something a lot of the ancient virtue theorists, sometimes seem to think and sometimes not. Of course, Aristotle explicitly didn't think that. He thought that they were natural slaves. But you got people like Cicero who says, we're all equal parts of this. Well, he didn't say equal, but we're all parts of humanity and everyone deserves respect and so forth. But he had no problem with slavery. He never explained it. But they think that there's this value of respect, and so they would think, therefore, it's the job of the state to promote it, to make people respectful. But you have to say, well, look, the state is going to be doing this in virtue of individuals doing various things, and they're bound by that respect too. And so you can't promote respect in ways that violate respect. So the idea that the natural political implementation of virtue ethics is a state that promotes virtue is a mistake, because virtue requires taking an attitude toward other people that's inconsistent with the kind of paternalistic micromanaging that the traditional virtue ethical state was favoring.
So what I had in mind by giving voice to that objection was something somewhat different. I had in mind, like, Hayek in The Fatal Conceit. Argues that we need to apply a different sort of, maybe putting it in terms of whether virtue applied to societies or state institutions was the wrong way to give voice to this line. But I had in mind that, Hayek in The Fatal Conceit says that we now live in such a large, complicated society that we have to apply different ways of thinking about ethics, maybe different virtues to our lives and our intimate orders and our intimate groupings, like families, relationships, blah, 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 as opposed to the extended order of society, the world out there. And maybe we could catch this out in terms of virtue ethics by thinking about, like, how a lawyer has to exhibit virtues to different degrees and in different ways when he's arguing his court case as opposed to when he's talking to his wife. The lawyer who, and this is a very non-Aristotelian way of thinking about it as I see it, the lawyer...
Well, it's a very Ciceronian way of thinking about it.
Maybe. The lawyer who were to treat his court case the way he treats a discussion with his wife would very likely lose the court case, whereas if he were to go home and get in this combative debate with his wife, he'd probably get a divorce very quickly, and we would view him as not a good husband, and we would view him as not a good lawyer in the other case. So why would we think that the way virtues work the same in the political realm as they do in the public space as they do in the private space of our intimate group lives?
Well, I mean, certainly, it's part of virtue to recognize that one and the same virtue will have different manifestations in different social contexts. I think that's sort of part of virtue ethics forever. There's this, often disagreement of what those contexts are. I agree that there are differences in these contexts, but I think that people have tended to be too comfortable with allowing radical differences, like basically all the things that cops are allowed to do. Right. But also, take another example that's sort of similar to your example, which I think is partly right and partly wrong. So in business ethics, there's this famous article by Albert Carr, I think called is it Business Bluffing or something like that. It's got bluffing in the title. It often appears in business ethics textbooks, where he says you don't use the same ethics in business that you would do in dealing with personal friends and family. He operates according to a different set of rules, which I think to some extent is right. But then he takes it to the sense of saying, well, look, it's like poker, where in poker they're trying to deceive you, and by playing the game you sort of consented to their deceiving you. And so likewise, when you're in business, when you're engaging in economic transactions in the market, they're trying to deceive you, and you've sort of consented to that by entering these economic transactions, which really seems and it's not just they don't have to, it's not just that they don't have to be as benevolent to you as you would be a family member, but actually that they can deceive you as long as they don't actually sort of actively lie and so forth. They can manipulate you and so forth. And I think it's just wrong. This idea that we've consenting to play a poker game. I mean, there's no such thing as consenting to engage in economic trade in the market. You just have to do it in order to
Right.
survive. And so the idea, really it sounds more like sort of the social contract argument
Right.
that somehow by just living in a place you've considered all kinds of crap from the government. Likewise, this idea that by living in a place you've considered all this kind of crap from business people. So so I think there's a limit to how far you can have these different roles mean different ethics things. Now, of course, part of Hayek's idea was, well, it doesn't make any sense to talk about. He said it doesn't make any sense to talk about the justice of distribution,
Right?
Because justice applies to only the actions of individuals and doesn't apply to spontaneous orders. But of course, you can talk about. You can always talk about the justice of a distribution into talk about the justice of what individuals, either individually or in concert with each other, should do in response to an existing distribution. So you can always talk about social justice and talk about what individuals should do.
But at that point, haven't you just conceded the point and gotten rid of the distributive justice and gone just back to the
No, because I think it's saying what people justly should do in response to a distribution, given distribution, whether they should try and change that distribution or not. I think that's an issue of distributive justice.
Okay.
And now it's true that sort of there's a kind of communism that can work at the level of the family that I think can't work at the level of society as a whole.
Right. That's what I also think Hayek had.
And that's fine. That's right. And in fact, if you try to apply it at the level of society as a whole, you'll cause, starvation and chaos. And if you're benevolent, you don't want to do that. And so
the rest of that quote is, if we applied the ethics to our intimate groupings, we would demolish them, and if we applied it to the intimate grouping ethics to the extended order, we would destroy it.
Yeah. So benevolence. Benevolence is when a simple-minded application of benevolence to the wider social order would have horrific results, then a nuanced understanding of benevolence would say, well, don't do that. But nevertheless, I don't think that's a reason to think that there's no reason to be concerned about systematic inequalities of wealth. I'm thinking that it's just not a problem. Now, if it's true that the only way we could get rid of them is by some sort of intrusive violation of people's property rights, then I'm saying, all right, well, I guess then the world sucks. We don't want to do that. But, to the extent that you can combat these kinds of inequalities, without violating libertarian rights, I think we should. It's a better society if more people can participate on an equal basis. The part of it is just that societies work better when more people's ideas can be can enter into the competition. And if there's a vast inequality of wealth between one group and another, then the lower group they may be living comfortably, but they're not able to participate as much in that conversation. And I think the society as a whole suffers from that.
Yeah, and not to mention that there might be something intrinsically wrong with excluding people from the conversation.
Yes.
Who would otherwise want to participate in it. Or excluding people from certain social practices, certain cultural rights, etc.
Yeah, I mean, so that it's so if you're, take the following example. People there are sometimes people who say things like, well, you shouldn't care if you're excluded. To take an extreme example, a lot of people say, well, black people shouldn't complain about the legacy of slavery because if the slavery never happened, then they would have been born back in Africa instead of here, and so they'd be living in much worse poverty.
Yeah.
Because actually they would never have been born at all, because history would have meant that different parents meant. But anyway,
we don't need to get into modal identity here.
Yeah, but anyway, the
trans-world identity.
Treating people like crap is not justified by the fact that your ability to do it is made possible by a series of events such that had they happened otherwise, that those persons would have been worse off. It's like if I come up to you and I punch you in the face and you fall over, and then by sheer luck, that means that you end up not being hit by a bullet that someone else was firing. Because I've actually benefited you by punching you in the face. I wasn't trying to benefit you, but as a matter of fact, you're better off. So now I might say, instead of me owing you, instead for punching you in the face, you owe me for saving you from the bullet. No. And so likewise, if people are excluded, when people are excluded from things, you could say, well, yeah, but under this regime where they're excluded, they're much better off, much more comfortable than they would have been before. Well, it's great. Want to keep them comfortable, good. We don't want to impoverish everyone in the name of equality. But if people, if people are excluded from things, it's just not a respectful way to treat people. And doesn't mean that you need all the bunch of stuff to solve it imposed by law, because that's also not a respectful way to treat people. But happily, that's not the only way we can deal with it.
The last question I always like to ask is, what are 3 works, could be books, articles, documentaries, what have you, that people, you think the listeners should read pertaining to this, or generally to learn more about what you're interested in?
Okay, so basically on class theory, libertarian class theory, 3 books I'd recommend. So one is an anthology of I was a co-editor of it, along with David Hart and Gary Chartier and Ross Kenyon. And it's titled, what the hell is it titled? Something like Social Class and State Power, an Alternative Radical Theory, or something like that.
Exploring an Alternative Radical Tradition.
That sounds right. So, Social Class and State Power, Exploring Alternative Radical Tradition. And it's just a collection of various works in classical liberal class theory, both more lefty ones and more righty ones, from basically from the 17th century through today. So this gives a range of different versions. Then, specifically on the French liberal class theorists, in particular Charles Comte, Charles Dunoyer, and Augustin Thierry, who wrote this journal in early 19th century France that developed a lot of these ideas early on. David Hart on his website has he's got a couple of different versions of his dissertation, and it's got a couple of different titles depending on the version, but most of them have either as the title or as the subtitle something like The Radical Liberalism of Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer. And that's useful because the class theory book that I mentioned before doesn't have stuff from them. Well, it has like a little snippet or something, but hardly anything from them has been translated. And so it's a really useful account of them. And then the third thing, for more specifically the kind of class theory that left libertarians go in for these days, there's another anthology, Markets Not Capitalism,
right,
by Gary Chartier and Charles Johnson, that has a bunch of mostly, it has a few older things like stuff from Benjamin Tucker in the 19th century, but it's mostly recent, like from the last 20 years, left libertarian analysis of the interaction between state power and the power of big business and the corporate elite. And so those are 3 things that come to mind.
All right. Well, Roderick Long, thank you for coming on the show. We hope to have you on again.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I'd like to thank Roderick again for coming onto the show and setting aside that afternoon at that busy conference for a really interesting and in-depth discussion. As I mentioned earlier, if you like this show and you want to support what we do, you can support us on Patreon. If you decide to do so, you get special bonus content and swag as a thank you for your support, including bonus roundtable episodes. There was recently a roundtable we did with Roderick, as well as 2 other guests we had on the show before, Kevin Carson and William Gillis, about the founding of the Center for a Stateless Society. So you can check that out. You will also get free books, buttons, and zines, depending on how much you donate, as well as the potential for special credit at the end of our show for helping out. If any of that sounds appealing to you, or if you just want to support us on having these type of conversations, you can go to patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/c4ss.org.